So the next day is the kitchen, and of course this day emerges, as I said at the outset, in part because a lot of revolutions happened in the kitchen. And as it turns out, I can see now from medieval scholarship, they also happen in the pages of the book. And we're going to find out where else they happen when Despina begins to start her work.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I'm going to speak from my avatar, so I don't have a word.
We can hear you.
Is that okay? So I'm going to show a video that is really a documentation. I don't see it as a piece in its own right. It documents the process of me weaving on a Jacquard loom from actually from 1850. As Andrew mentioned, Babbage actually and Ada Lovelace were inspired by the Jacquard loom to develop the analytical engine. And in fact, the same mechanism, the punch cards that one uses to program a Jacquard loom is what then IBM used for the first computers in 1948-50. So as I said, while it is a documentation of me weaving this hybrid material, it's really also a meditation of these notions of repetition, rhythm, what happens when you engage with a certain embodied algorithmic materiality, and when the body becomes part of that process. And also, what's the difference then between digital and non-digital algorithmic systems? What happens when you bring an embodied technology and explore algorithm as something that really has that actual materiality? So I'm going to play the video, and then of course, what happens when new materials are woven, and how then those create new types of behaviors to some extent. And in fact, adtextum, it means weaving in Latin. So there's a really interesting relationship between text and weaving, between the warp, which represents a certain cosmological axis that's just there. It's part of how your loom is set up, that you actually also have to set up, and the weft, which brings in different narratives.
Skipping over the ocean like a song. Oh.
So, let me know if you have any questions or something that I can add to it.
I would like to ask a quick question.
Sure.
The way in which the weave was going, this is traditional Greek work, and then the way in which you brought in sound, particularly sound of kind of a rock, sort of rock star, not rock star, but you know, like sort of rock and roll, light rock. And I'm curious, what was your thinking of that particular encounter between the popular, or that kind of very wonderful music that brings up many memories for me anyway, and the way, and what you were trying to do with the showing of the different colors and the hammer. I'm just curious how the sounds and the sound of the hammer, which I thought was amazing, and the way in which things were going through the threads and how that connected with computing. If you could maybe make a couple more comments about that.
Sure. First of all, as I said, because I do see it as documentation more than a edited video, all the sounds were ambient sounds. So it was sounds that they were playing as we were working, and then when I was just playing with the fabric. So I have to say that the last sound, the famous song from Midnight Cowboy, actually, that's where it comes from, does have this humorous aspect, and there's a certain sexiness, a certain retro aspect to it, and as you said, it evokes a lot of memories. So they were not in a way predetermined or premeditated. But in terms of the whole clash I'm trying to create in all of this work is this notion of what does the past bring into the present to create the future? What's that tension? And in terms of the loom, the more I was weaving, which was my first time in a very old, we kind of hacked the restoration of an 1850 original Jacquard loom. The whole process is it's really like writing a text, and it's very reminiscent of this text that that Barthe has, where he talks about the difference between text and work. And and then of course, the more I was doing the hammer, the more I was thinking about Heidegger. So it was also a way of bringing up all these different philosophical notions, but in a playful way, which is yet quite woven in the material. But what again, and it's kind of interesting as my own practice emerges, this, I don't see this as the work. The work is what the fabric, or this tiny piece of fabric, which is made of conductive yarns, which therefore has a sculptural dimension that a regular fabric wouldn't have. So it's also playing with new materialities, literally a new materialism that you create on a grid system, which also brings all these notions of modernity into it.
See, it's a fantastic thing, Despina. I'm just so pleased you're exploring it. And there's been some wonderful work around Jacquard. I was wondering, you mentioned about hammer, and I was thinking about the Luddites and the hand loom weavers who were put out of work, who destroyed the Jacquard looms because they were the equivalent of the AI at the time, increasing productivity. How have you thought around the Luddites and the destruction, and how might that fit into your perspectives?
Absolutely, and I mean, a lot of my thinking is around what is an algorithm, what does the technology do, and in fact, in Greece, where I came to do some research, women, in the beginning of industrialization, burned the looms because they hated them. It was a symbol of oppression it was, you know, we have this romantic, nostalgic idea. So every technology has its own weight and its own epistemology, ideology rather. And so I'm really interested in trying to uncover and recover what are those elements that from a digital to non-digital algorithmic system we can translate, and which are those constants that are this notion of oppression. Because although I'm really interested in this notion of the weft that gives you the ability to create your own narrative, at the same time traditional patterns also replicate, like algorithms today, the same normative and moral behaviors of the time that you then kind of transpose. And it's when innovation comes in, usually in the form of a new material or a new technique, that you can kind of, even in the fabric, you see that revolt, so to speak, of that patterning.
Very interesting.
Can I make a comment, or better try to draw a transversal link? It may somehow go at least in part against the grain of what was just said about the ideologies and the political elements of these of every technology, and especially Despina, your comment about the text and the loom, the working on the loom as the writing of a text. I was linking it back to the notion of memory, that and the way the text and the memory have a different relationship in the Middle Ages, versus a notion of text in the modern, where the text becomes a fixed reference point, a universal code, which ideally exists in a pure state, and all our experiences are sort of noisy manifestations of this pure verb or text. And because you are working on it before coding what goes on in the machine, somehow I saw a transversal connection with the notion of, with the use of memory in memorizing a text so that it could be used differently. And both evoked the notion of pattern, which is not the same as text. As in, a pattern is something that enters repetitions, but can also meet different patterns, can be altered, and may be an alternative paradigm to the one of the linearity of the text, which we have inherited from modernity, and now we are with so much difficulty at trying to sort of question, because despite it all, it remains, the code and the text are very often flattened or collapsed, but they aren't exactly the same thing. And the practice of creating patterns, or better, the practice can itself be a pattern, precisely because it does not have to be necessarily first verbal or linguistic. And for reasons that I am not yet able to articulate, I see a point of contact, perhaps a bit elusive, with the notion of memorizing and then being able to repeat. And I found this very interesting. While I was watching the documentation you had, I was somehow re-listening to the words of Andrew about the books. It became a very interesting merging image.
Yeah. Well, so many things I can ask, answer, but just, I don't know if it was clear. The punching of the cards is actually the code. That's the code. That's what you punch.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there is also this notion of just it's articulated, and that's what then creates the repetition. And that's why I referenced Barthe, because in Barthe, that's why the text is different than the work, and it has this openness, this multiplicity. In the woven end product, even though it's a pattern, it's also a language. It's also a text for those who can read it. So it's a code, but it's also a text. What I'm really mostly interested in is that when you do use a new material, in this case a conductive yarn, then you can connect it with and send data through and in it, is then you give it yet another dimensionality and new way of looking at pattern, of looking at text, and therefore looking at algorithmic systems.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's very similar because I work on manuscripts. I got very interested in conductive ink for similar reasons, because it breaks down the materiality binaries of the manuscript, and it's something you think of as supremely analog suddenly becomes digital and analog, and I think that's fascinating. Yeah.
Yes, that's very important. That's there's a comment here from Amina, which is, in Iran they sing to remember the patterns of carpet weaving, which I think is fantastic, and then there's a link.